welcome back to Hilaal Live. Now, December the 5th, 2013 will, of course, remain a day which many South Africans would mourn. Of course, it was 10 years ago to that day when President Nelson Mandela had passed on. Now, when we talk about President Nelson Mandela from a global perspective, he is seen as somebody as a hero, freedom fighter, stalwart, and so many more. And he didn't transcend only onto the political sphere, but also in sports and arts and culture. Now, what sort of reputation does President Mandela hold in terms of how the international community sees it? Joining me now, I'd like to welcome Tshepo Matseba. He's the Managing Director of Reputation First. Mr. Matseba, good day, and thank you so much for joining us here on Hilaal Live.
Good day. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to be here.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. Mr. Matseba, father of the nation, and I think that's how South Africans, would see the late President Nelson Mandela. And it is a supposed reputation and status that extends beyond our borders, doesn't it?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So the brand and the image that Nelson Mandela, our former president, left globally is one that is symbolic of unity, one that is symbolic of global peace, but also he was a brand that is willing to engage robustly whenever he was challenged or whenever he was faced with a challenge, especially during we remember him during the days of CODESA, when South Africa was negotiating towards the constitutional democracy, negotiating towards a peaceful resolution. He was a peaceful man, but he was also quite a robust statesman. But additionally, one cannot remember Mandela without thinking about sports. When you consider the role that he played in encouraging and inspiring the Springboks towards that 1995 World Cup championship. And so he was a statesman. He was seen amongst children. He was seen amongst adults. And he was also able to tell the global powerhouses, if we may call them for now, countries such as the United States, that, your enemies are not necessarily my enemies. And there, in reference to what the US at the time expected to become the enemies of South Africa under Mandela, and Mandela refused, of course, to be associated with situations where he would be enemies of Libya or other countries, particularly in the Middle East, because the US at the time and the West in general at the time was generally uncooperative with countries in the Middle East, and they've made enemies of them. And so Mandela was that brand that reminds us of standing firm for principles and being consistent around those principles. And you see that in today's South Africa, where the country, through its foreign affairs minister or minister of international relations, Dr. Naledi Pandor, where South Africa, and through its the president of South Africa, but also the president of the ANC, President Cyril Ramaphosa, where South Africa calls a spade in different parts of the world. You've seen that in Ukraine, Russia, where South Africa has said, but this is a war and the war needs to stop. And similarly, you are seeing a much more stronger stance from South Africa in resemblance of the ethos of Nelson Mandela when it comes to declaring the conflict in Gaza and the bombardment of Palestine by Israel as actually genocide, and ultimately reporting Israel, or rather recording a matter with the International Criminal Court against Israel, demonstrating that the country really comes from the ethos of high engagement, but also more of a consistent, peaceful resolutions.
Yeah, I want to touch on, of course, what is happening in Gaza at the moment, Mr. Matseba, because, we just attended for the last 2 days the Global Solidarity for Palestine, a conference that happened in Johannesburg. And every single Palestinian speaker speaks of, President Nelson Mandela and, of course, him leading the fight against the apartheid South African government. So you look at it in terms of him being that freedom fighter stalwart, and he did lead that way, didn't he? And that reputation is seen not just only in, of course, Palestine, but across the world, places like Cuba, Latin America, where they hold the legacy of the former president in such a high stature?
Yeah, I mean, he was a brand and a leader that led through what one may call leading through the head, the heart, and the hands. And that's because he spoke truth when it mattered, but he also knew how to get into difficult conversations in very uncomfortable circumstances, where most African leaders would simply become nice to the other side and just be polite. And because most of the time, Africa is caught in this conundrum of the begging bowl of waiting for somebody to sponsor and to provide us with resources. And it makes it difficult for African leaders to have robust engagements, to challenge the status quo, to challenge geopolitics. But the legacy of Nelson Mandela, if you go to countries, for example, when we went to Russia recently for the Russia-Africa Summit, the images of South Africa that you saw in that conference room, in all those plenaries, were the images of Nelson Mandela. And so he remains a global icon. He remains South Africa's most iconic symbol. It would be helpful, perhaps, if that symbolic nature translated into consistent action, especially if we come back here at home in South Africa, where the country now, despite all the lessons and the principles that they would have learned from Nelson Mandela, the country is bleeding with things such as high levels of crime that we are not able to respond to, corruption that is rising, and most importantly, this energy crisis that is covered in a combination of incompetence, but also a combination of this thing about cadre deployment. That if we had applied the principles of Madiba, Madiba knew how to get the right people in the room. He could appoint his comrades to key roles, but he also recognized the role of other leaders. For example, at some point he had a former IFP president, Dr. Mangosuthu Buthelezi, as a minister of, I think, Home Affairs. And in his cabinet, there was diversity. And that's because Madiba recognized the value of diversity and inclusion.
One final question, Mr. Matseba. I saw a poster on one of the newspapers asking the question, is it time to let go of Madiba? But I mean, it's difficult for that to happen, isn't it? Because it's like asking, the people of Burkina Faso to forget about Thomas Sankara, or the Algerians to forget about Ben Bella. The list goes on. And for South Africans, he will always remain. I mean, you spoke about 1995, the 1996 Africa Cup of Nations, but, away from sports also, just him being that political figurehead that South Africa needed at the time. It is very difficult for South Africans to let go because he does remain part and parcel of who we are in this country.
He is part of South Africa's cultural fabric. He's part of South Africa's economic fabric. He's part of South Africa's brand image and heritage. He's probably by far one of the fathers of this nation that will forever be remembered by generations and generations to come. That said, it doesn't mean that he led alone. South Africa has been fortunate to have many, many great leaders from the days of the struggle, leaders who actually became laureates, Nobel Prize laureate winners. But Madiba really, really symbolizes that icon that could understand economics, politics, sports, people, life, reconciliation, peace, and harmony, and understanding and valuing the principle I highlighted earlier, which is about embracing diversity and truly embracing inclusion.
Mr. Matseba, thank you so much for joining us. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much.
That's Tshepo Matseba. He's the Managing Director of Reputation First, just talking about the long-lasting legacy that Nelson Mandela left us as South Africans. 10 years to the day, of course, of his passing on, and really a very sad day for South Africans as our first democratic president had left this earth. After the break, I'll have your latest in news. Do stay tuned.